Well, several questions are now being asked about the planned deployment of 2,900 SANDF soldiers to the eastern DRC. There have been rising tensions there. The deployment is officially to help fight against illegal armed groups in that area, including, as I understand it, a group called the M23 militia. But there are concerns about the lack of air support for our troops at the moment. Our military only appears to have one, perhaps two, working Oryx transport helicopters. You need those to move soldiers in and out of what will essentially be jungle warfare. Faith Mabera is a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Faith, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time. How difficult is the terrain that our soldiers will be going into? How difficult is the situation in the eastern DRC?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to the viewers. Yes, this particular deployment of South African National Defence Forces under the auspices of the SADC Commission in the DRC comes at an interesting juncture, and it's important to lay out the context here. So it's happening in the context of the ongoing withdrawal of MONUSCO, which is the UN peacekeeping presence there. Also, we saw at the end of last year the withdrawal of the East African Community Regional Force that then President Tshisekedi had asked for withdrawal of that and the ending of that mandate, and we saw those troops also moving out of Eastern DRC, which then suggests to us that we're dealing with a very complex security situation, one which has seen a resurgent M23 movement rebel force gaining a particular stronghold, particularly in North Kivu, of which the capital is Goma. So we saw particularly in developments last week leading up to earlier this week, that they had particularly gained significant territory in the outskirts of Goma, and there was indications that perhaps their intent was to seize that capital, which would have significant repercussions from not only a perspective of control of territory, but also leverage on their advantage. So in this context, then we see one military presence leaving and another coming to take in. But it's important to bear in mind that this SADC mission is different from another within the UN context. There's also a South African contribution to the Force Intervention Brigade, which is a robust element within the UN presence that was also particularly mandated to neutralize this armed movement. So it's a terrain characterized by a plethora of armed groups who have sufficient and deep knowledge of the terrain. It's also a security situation and a landscape that demands significant capabilities from whichever intervening forces. These demands include the form of air defense and air support, tactical and intelligence, and also other logistical and transport capabilities.
Does this mean then, if I've got the timelines, I might have got them muddled up, Faith, but could this mean then that we'll have two different South African forces in the same area at the same time, or would one leave while the other arrives?
So these are some of the questions that are being raised, Stephen, because if we're having a sort of deployment of a SADC mission at this juncture for a new year period, and at the same time, as I mentioned, we have ongoing drawdown of MONUSCO. Within MONUSCO, we had the Force Intervention Brigade, right, I mentioned, and at the core of the FIB, if I may call it that, are also South African, Tanzanian, and Malawian troops who formed a significant troop contributing component of that particular robust unit within MONUSCO. So it's the questions that are being asked is how then will we address the question of interoperability between the two. So in as much as you're granting what is essentially a bit of a peace enforcement mandate to services, how will they, for instance, on the ground, liaise and coordinate with the FIB force and MONUSCO force that has also been working with the Congolese National Defense Forces. So I think this is one of the strategic dilemmas that we face just from a tactical and operational perspective, which presents us with interesting questions. But also, as you've rightfully mentioned at the beginning, the other questions that are being raised about our own troops' capabilities. So you rightfully mentioned that in the state, given the state of decline that has been charged at with regard to the SANDF, we also see a lack of defunct operational equipment. So very few functional river attack helicopters, very few Onyx helicopters, which are very crucial in such a mission. So those are some of the questions that then present very interesting conundrums, if you will.
Faith, this has been a problem for a very long time, and we were part of a mission, I think was it 10, maybe 12 years ago. Then we were part of this UN mission. Now we're sending another 2,900 soldiers. Now, if I wanted to be very cynical and perhaps slightly inhuman, I would suggest and ask, is there really any point in sending our soldiers to something we haven't been able to fix for a long time? But if I wanted to be slightly more humane, I would probably say that the people of Goma require people from South Africa, from SADC, to play a role in trying to bring peace to them.
It's interesting that you've laid out those overlapping perspectives, Stephen. So you're correct in saying that there's been questions rise about what's the need of one more kinetic military security-focused operation, while we have MONUSCO, you have FIB, you have the East African Regional Force that haven't been able to realize transformative outcomes. Despite the deployment. For instance, MONUSCO has been deployed nearly 2-decade presence in Eastern DRC. So you're right in asking those questions. And I think I would point you to the kind of political dimension that this brings us to. So it's interesting that the DRC, at the moment that we saw the East African Regional Force being deployed, which was in 2022, had just joined the East African community. And now we have a SADC force being deployed. So there's almost a hint at somewhat an inclination towards forum shopping on the part of the DRC that he's sort of leveraging to see which one sort of panders more to his longer-term geopolitical, geostrategic objectives. And this is interesting because for a long time, one of the gripes that not only the local population has had and the frustration that they've had with the UN mission there is that they've failed to essentially realize their mandate of protection of civilians and also the mandate of improving the security situation over time. And this points to, as you've mentioned, the understanding of the local dynamics, the conflict dynamics, the structural dynamics that have fed into and fueled the conflict over such a long time. But also it's important to pay attention to not only looking at the solution through the lens of a very security-oriented approach. There's bigger questions here to be asked about the role of addressing a multifaceted approach to addressing the broader conundrum in Eastern DRC. So what element does a political process play alongside a development process, alongside a military process? So those are some of the tension, the trade-offs, the dilemmas that we'll be faced with as the SADC force enters. And as I've mentioned also, if you have two very significant military missions or military presences leaving or vacating, what happens to such a force that is just going to continue to extending its operations in a very complicated field with insufficient operational capabilities that have been questioned, and also with, for lack of a better term, limited understanding of just how complicated the terrain in which they're entering in and how this terrain interacts with the local dynamics that have, as I've mentioned, fuel the dynamics.
And Faith, Rwanda? Rwanda is a country which recently had armed forces as close to us as Mozambique, at the request of Mozambique to deal with the situation there. Rwanda has consistently denied sort of involvement with the M23 group. How do you think Rwanda sees what is really an intervention by us at the DRC's request?
So it's almost a squaring off. Some analysts see it as a chance for a potential face-off between a rivalry of sorts between South Africa and Kigali. Had souring relations, forced relations for a long time now. It's also interesting you bring up the Mozambique question, Stephen, because it's now also being asked, are we not overstretching an already weakened South African National Defence Force? So can you really deploy simultaneously in two different theatres, each with very context-specific demands, and not risk overstretching your troops, and also in a way degrading and undermining the long-term objectives that you have for both of these missions. So the Rwanda question is interesting because there's also been reports, some of which have been backed up by a UN report a couple of years ago, that actually managed to trace and underline a lot of the allegations about the kind of support that the Kigali regime was funneling towards M23, the rebel forces on the ground. So it speaks to that politics of destabilization that has had such a pervasive hold over the Great Lakes region. It speaks also to just the kind of geostrategic nature of Eastern DRC, not least because of the kind of mineral-rich reserves it has. I mean, this is one of the world's largest deposits of coltan, of lithium, and all this abundance of natural resources instinctively point us towards resources almost acting as another driver of conflict. So that competition for resources and how they interact in a very interesting manner with both regional and local level geopolitical dynamics in realpolitik.
Faith Mabera at the Institute for Global Dialogue, really appreciate the time. Many different elements to that story, many different actors to the situation in the DRC.